Morning. Well, I thought this morning in a Bible class we could spend a little time on looking at the conflicts that have been taking place in Israel since 1948, and of course of more modern times and in recent months the Gaza conflict. You know, Israel is ranked about 154th amongst the world's nations in land size. It's a very small country. It's about 95th in the world's population, having a population of approaching 10 million people. They make up less than 0.2% of the world's population. But despite this, that little land is rarely ever out of the news. The focal point for Israel, of course, is the land, and of course Jerusalem and the Temple Mount. As you may or may not know, while they control both parts of the city of Jerusalem, they do not control the Temple Mount. The Temple Mount is under the control of the Palestinian authorities, and therefore the Jews are very limited in what they can do on the Temple Mount. But for the Arab nations, of course, that surround it, it's an inherent hatred of the Jewish people, and they would love to wipe them out. 1917 to 1947, just a brief history. After hundreds of years of exile, Israel began to realise that their only hope of survival lay in re-establishing a homeland where they could live without fear of persecution. You know, in the 1400s, they suffered intense persecution by the Spanish, and the Spanish in the 1400s expelled every Jew out of Spain. The French did the same. Under the direction of the Catholic Church, they persecuted the Jews. That's why many of the Jews finished up in the countries they finished up in prior to the Second World War. Many of them fled to Poland, others fled to Russia and settled in those parts of the world. In Russia, prior to Hitler's persecution of the Jews in the 1930s, Russia had the pogroms, and the Jews suffered terribly under Russian persecution. How many of you have seen the film or heard the musical Fiddler on the Roof? That story is set during the Russian pogroms and speaks of the persecution that the Jews were suffering under Russia themselves. But finally in 1947, the UN stepped in, and we won't go into all the conflict that went on before. But in 1947, the UN voted the following petitioning of Palestine, in which the state of Transjordan was formed. You can see on the map there, that orangey part. Although not all of that territory was to be under Israeli control, in Israel, you can see Israel were only given those blue sections, and they were not given that orangey section right down. Oh, where are we? The map's this side. That orange section there included the Gaza Strip on the border with Israel with Egypt itself. But the moment the British troops departed in 1947, conflict broke out. But I believe that there was a prophecy from the book of Ezekiel that was indeed enacted at this time. And this is that prophet. In Ezekiel 37, if you remember the story, Ezekiel was shown a vision of a whole valley of dead, dry bones. And a question was asked of Ezekiel, and the question was, Son of man, can these bones live? Well, Ezekiel looked over the dead bodies, the bones. He said, Lord, you alone know. And this is what happened. And as a response of that, Ezekiel was told to prophesy over the bones. But we have to understand that it was not one single prophecy, but three separate prophecies. And this is what happened. He prophesied as I was commanded, and as I prophesied there was a noise, and behold, a shaking, and the bones came together, bone to his bone, and when I beheld, lo, the sinews and flesh came up upon them. The skin covered them above, but there was no breath in them. There was no life in that body. The nation, I believe that this was a fulfillment back in 1948. The nation were back in their land, but there is no spiritual life in the nation of any note today. In the prophecy, life did not come in the vision until after the second prophecy was given by Ezekiel. And I believe that that is a future day when Israel turns back to the Lord in repentance, as we mentioned last night in our message, then life will come again into the nation. But Israel today are just a secular nation living in the land. There were a number of conflicts given between 1948 and 1967, but I want to focus on the 1967 war that took place in the nation of Israel. And this is a map that shows us who attacked. We're still not over? Yep. We've got to work between the back and the front to get our slides in sequence, but never mind. This was the attack plan of the Arabs in the Six-Day War of 1967. It started when Nasser, the president of Egypt, expelled the United Nations from the Sinai Peninsula, that pale section at the bottom, and declared our basic goal is the destruction of Israel. Well, God was with the nation, and certainly things happened during that 67 war. The ceasefire line was established 6 days later, and at the end of that war, Israel were holding the Gaza Strip, which I've identified there. They had taken over the Sinai Desert all the way down to Egypt, and Judea and Samaria. They'd moved up across and taken all what we know as the West Bank today, which was previously under Jordanian control, and they took the Golan Heights, which is the heights north of the Sea of Galilee there, bordering on Syria. They took all these things and they held them. Now we could talk about other conflicts between 67 and 1973, but again it would take all morning. So let me move you across to the conflict that involves the Gaza Strip. The Gaza Strip is a narrow strip of land that is wedged between Israel and Egypt. It's on the Mediterranean Sea. Originally, of course, it was the home of what nation? Who lived in the Gaza Strip back in biblical history? But the Philistines. Good. Don't be frightened to speak up. Yeah, it was the territory of the Philistines. And the Philistines had been there since the days when Egypt were a power. And of course they remained there after Israel conquered the land. In fact, they were the arch enemies of the Jewish nation. And indeed, they are not Arabs. We should make that clear. They came from the island of Crete. They were settlers from there, and they were probably European in their original background. The Philistines haven't been heard of since the reign of David. Most of them were indeed wiped out with conflict with Israel. And if you trace history, there is no real history of the Philistines after David became king. Later, after that, it was occupied by the Ottoman Empire, the Turkish Ottomans and Muslims. And today, though, then, of course, the British during the First World War captured it. And today it forms the smaller of the two Palestinian territories, the other being the West Bank. It's only about 40 kilometres long and about 11 kilometres wide at its widest point. It is a very small piece of land. The top population today is around 2.3 million. And after the creation of Israel in 1948, Egypt actually controlled the Gaza for nearly 2 decades. It was under Egyptian territory. But after, as I said, the War of 67, Israel gained control of it and the West Bank. So for the next 38 years, Israel controlled the Strip and enabled the construction of 21 Jewish settlements in the Gaza Strip. The Gaza Strip is a very fertile piece of land. It's great for growing crops, and that's why it has been so important for many nations in the past. But in 1993, the peace agreement that took place there in Oslo, the PLO were organisation and Israel determined that they would allow the Gaza Strip to self-government, and that would take place in the West Bank and Gaza. So what they said was that there's problems here, we own the territory, we've taken it over, but we've agreed that the PLO can govern in both of those places. And as a result, Israel in 1994 withdrew its armed forces from Gaza City, but peace didn't last very long. Violence on both sides derailed the complete handover, and the conflict resulted in the death of some 5,000 Palestinians and 1,400 Israelis between 2000 and 2005. So in 2005, the government made a decision about the Gaza Strip. Thanks, brother. And it was called the 2005 Disengagement Plan. Under international and domestic pressure, Israel withdrew around 9,000 Israeli settlers from the Strip. It was not a popular decision in Israel itself. Not only that, they withdrew all their military forces and leaving the Gaza to be governed by the Palestinian Authority. The cost to the government was over $2 billion because they had to pay all the farmers out to leave their homes. In fact, the farmers had to be physically carried out of their homes by the army. They didn't want to leave. And to be honest, there were many Palestinians that were not happy to see the farmers go, because the farmers had employment for many of those Palestinian people. At the time, there were 1.3 roughly Palestinians living in the Gaza Strip. But with the withdrawal of Israel, another group appeared on the scene. And this is the group that we know as Hamas. Hamas was founded by a Palestinian activist named Ahmed Yassin in 1987. In 1973, the organisation became affiliated with the Muslim Brotherhood, which originated in Egypt. It was a banned organisation in Egypt because of their political stirring up, and for many years they were not allowed, they were banned. But then the Egyptian government a number of years back got a little soft and gave them status again, but the trouble they caused in Egypt was so bad politically that they again banned them, and is a banned organisation in Egypt today. But in 2006, Hamas won the election to govern the Gaza by campaigning on providing a clean government without corruption. Now, there's a pack of lies if ever there was one. In 2007, Hamas took control of the Gaza Strip from the rival Palestinian faction group Fatah, who were based in the West Bank. But since then, not one election has been held in the Gaza Strip since 2007. So they rule by their own power. The people have no selection in it. Not long after the withdrawal of Jewish citizens from the Gaza, rockets began being fired into Israel from the Gaza Strip. Remember, in their election, Hamas had also said that as part of their platform that they had the right on behalf of the people to engage in conflict with Israel. And that was something that the Palestinians thought was a good thing, and it created massive problems. Thank you, brother. Well, between 2012 and 2022, not long after they took control, attacks across the border that separated from Gaza from Israel began to occur. They raided across the border. Rockets began to be fired into Israel from the Gaza Strip. Since 2012, the rocket attacks have continued whenever Hamas have been able to secure enough rockets to continue their attacks. So between that period, in order to combat terrorists, Israel surrounded the Gaza and put border controls into effect. And that's why it was done, to stop raiding out of there. They've done the same thing on the West Bank. If any of you have seen, in some areas near the towns, there are huge concrete walls. In other parts of the country, around the West Bank, it is wire fenced to keep terrorists from raiding into Israeli territory, not the territory that was taken, but the territory that was given to them under the UN. This gives you an idea of what happened between 2007 and 2012. 2007, there were 1,300 Qassam rockets fired into southern Israel. 2008, there were 1,500 plus, and then lots of mortars that were all fired into southern Israel. In 2009, the Jews responded with what they called Operation Cast Lead. And during that conflict, there were quite a number of Palestinians killed. But in 2009, finally a truce was agreed to, and things went quiet again. In 2011, though, more rockets were fired. But then in 2012, serious conflict broke out again. The response by the Israelis, they called it Operation Pillar of Defense. And during that time, the commander of Hamas's military wing was killed in an Israeli rocket attack. During that time, there were 100 rockets launched against Israel in just 24 hours. And when the Palestinians blamed the Israeli government for the upsurge in violence, and the reason they went to war again with Israel, because they were accusing the military of attacks on Gazan citizens leading up to that time. Now, in all of the conflict between the Gaza, Hamas and Israel, Hamas has always been the initiator of the conflict. They're always the ones that have started it. And we need to remember that. They were protesting about the blockade of Gaza and the occupation of the West Bank and the East Jerusalem as the reason for the rocket attacks. But during the conflict, more than 1,500 sites in the Gaza Strip were struck, and they were targeted by places where rockets were being launched, weapon depots, government facilities and apartments. But the response was they fired over 1,400 rockets into Israel, but 142 of them fell inside Gaza itself. Well, where are they getting their weapons from? Well, most of the rockets they fire are Iranian-made and Russian-made. Both of those have been providing armaments for Hamas. It's interesting, of course, to note, anybody know who the biggest provider of funds for terrorist groups amongst the so-called terrorist organisations? Who provides all the funds for them, the majority? Anybody know? Pardon? Iran are giving huge help, but they're not the major ones. Russia? No, not even Russia. No. Getting close, Qatar. The little country of Qatar has the smallest population almost in the Middle East, but are extremely rich because of their oil fields. Their population is probably equal to the number of foreign workers who work in Qatar to get the oil out of the ground. But Qatar, Bin Laden was financed out of Qatar, and many of the Arab nations who are in conflict with Israel are indeed being funded out of Qatar. Thank you, brother. Well, to combat the raiding, and by this time tunnelling, because that's where they were getting a lot of their armaments through, Israel constructed this wall, and because of the tunnelling, the wall is about 65 kilometres long. It goes all around the Gaza, right across and out to sea even, to prevent coming around the sea even into the land. Because of the tunnelling, they actually sunk the wall. Nobody tells you exactly how far it is, but it's somewhere between around 20 to 30 feet or plus in the ground to prevent tunnelling into Israel. And they also have in the wall monitoring equipment so that they can hear if there's tunnelling or activity near the wall. Next slide, brother. July-August conflict continues. The kidnapping and killing of 3 Israeli teenagers by Hamas. There was another 7-week war. 2,100 Palestinians were killed. 73 Israelis, 67 of those were soldiers. March 18, we have Palestinian protests began at the Gaza fence border with Israel. Israel opened fire to keep them back. 170 Palestinians were killed in several months of protests, and fighting broke out again between Hamas and Israeli forces. May 21, Hundreds of Palestinians were injured by Israeli security forces at the mosque on the Temple Mount. Hamas demanded Israel at this stage withdraw security forces from the compound. Israel launched air raids in Gaza in response to what was said were rockets fired from Gaza. And in the fighting that went on for 11 days, at least 260 people were killed in Gaza and 13 people died in Israel. Here, brother. August 22, again, conflict takes place. More than 30 Palestinians, including women and children, were killed in new air attacks carried out by Israeli planes. Palestinian Islamic Jihad, whose 2 commanders were killed in the airstrikes, fires dozens of rockets into Israel in response. October 23. And this is where the modern conflict that's been going on now for approaching a year. Hamas raided into Israel. They took 1,200 Israeli citizens were killed and 251 were taken hostage. Over 2,200 rockets at that time were fired into Israel. It became, which is recognised today, as the 3rd deadliest terrorist attack since data collection had begun in the 1970s. As of July, of course, this year, 116 of those prisoners have been released in prison exchange agreements. Some 65 hostages are reported to have been killed during the conflict that's gone on, but about 115 still remain in captivity, although no one has confirmation of how many of them are still alive. Well, where do we go from here? In November 2023, ground forces entered the Gaza Strip, and Israel have been amazed at what they have uncovered. Hamas militants have built a maze of hidden tunnels which have been discovered extending across most of the Gaza Strip. And they're not just mere tunnels. Snaking beneath dense residential areas, the passageways allow fighters to move around free from the eye of the enemy. There are bunkers for stockpiling weapons, food and water, command centres, and tunnels wide enough to actually drive cars as big as jeeps down. Some of them use electrical, like golf buggy type vehicles. Ordinary looking doors and hatches serve as disguised access points, letting Hamas fighters dart out on a mission and then slip back out of sight. Many of the entrances have been hidden in hospitals, schools and public buildings, and that's been one of the major problems that Israel has faced. In the hospital in the north, where there was so much controversy about Israel trying to preserve it, but it also deal with the problem of Hamas, they discovered their main command centre was under the hospital. There was a bank of computers, and I've seen photos of it, that would have stretched from here to that back wall away. It was their main computer command centre. Very sophisticated, as good as any major business would have their computer set up. The power they were using to run those computers were tapped into the hospital's power source. There were certain floors in the hospital that were under the control of Hamas. There were trapdoors in the hospital that led into that, and the hospital knew what was going on, but I'm guessing they were powerless to stop it. Hamas has held tremendous power over the people of Gaza for so many years. It was a revelation to the Israelis when they got in there. Thank you, brother. This is one of the biggest tunnels that they found This was near the Gaza border. They know that tunnel construction began in Gaza before they withdrew in 2005. It had been going on, but it was ramped up after Hamas took control of the Strip 2 years later. And that's why Israel started restricting the movement of goods and people in and out for security reasons. They knew that they were bringing in lots of material to try and build these tunnels. At its peak, almost 2,500 tunnels were running under the Egyptian border, smuggling in fuel and weapons to be used by Hamas and other militant groups. Huge number of tunnels were going out of the Gaza at the bottom and into the Sinai Peninsula, which was under Egyptian control by now because that was handed back in 1993 according to the Oslo Peace Accord. Thank you, brother. The IDF said it had destroyed more than 100 kilometres of tunnels in airstrikes. That was their first method of dealing with them. They were using ground-penetrating bombs, which meant they didn't explode when they hit the ground. They went into the ground, deep into the ground, and then they would explode to try and destroy the tunnels. Well, at that time, Hamas made a claim that they had about 500 kilometres of tunnels, and about only 5% were destroyed at this time. To put it in perspective, the London Underground is only 400 kilometres long and mostly above ground. So the amount of tunnelling underground was massive. Thank you, brother. It's estimated that their tunnels is between 350 and 450 kilometres, and that's just in the northern part of the Gaza Strip. It's far higher than even Israel estimated. They figured it was about 250 miles. That is an astounding figure given that Gaza is only 150 square kilometres in total size. It's also estimated that there are around 100 miles of tunnels underneath Khan Yunis, that is the southern part, where indeed the capital Rafah is under attack by the Israelis at the moment. It is said that Hamas has used more than 6,000 tonnes of concrete and 180 tonnes of steel for its extensive tunnel work, and the cost is in tens of millions of dollars invested in the project. Somehow they must have smuggled in equipment to do the tunnelling. You couldn't tunnel that amount by hand, but it's been a massive attempt. These are just pictures of some of the tunnels, of course, that Israel have discovered. Thank you, brother. Some rooms serve as command centres. Others are used to store equipment. In recent months, hostages. To do tunnels on the ground, Israel needs to find the entrances, and they're often hidden in the basements of civilian buildings, leading into concrete-lined tunnels. That's been the problems that Israel has faced to destroy them. We know that hospital in the north was absolutely hiding the major command centre of Hamas. We know that they launch their rockets from schools. They use civilian public buildings to launch their rockets from. You know, in recent attacks in the south, you know what they did? They took the rocket launchers right to the border with Egypt. And their purpose for doing that, and they're launching rockets from there, and the purpose was, if Israel missed and they went into Egyptian territory, then maybe that would bring Egypt into the conflict. They are very, very clever, ruthless people. Most of these tunnels, though, are about 6.5 feet tall, about 3 foot wide, and they moved through them in single file. Thanks, brother. These tunnels, such as these, have been documented in the Rafah area, that's right in the south, where they used to bring all types of goods and products into Gaza from Egypt. These are smuggling tunnels. They cross at different lengths, different depths, because there are so many of them. Egypt tried, because they do not like Hamas, they're a banned group, they actually had an extensive program, and a lot of the tunnels they found, they were pumping seawater into them to flood the tunnels so they became useless. But the number that have been built there have just been too many to even combat. Thank you, brother. Hidden entrances, booby traps, often equipped with remotely triggered bombs or explosives rigged with tripwires. Many are hidden in building basements. The only way to find them is to send soldiers in by foot to find them. And one of the main dangers the Israeli soldiers face in going into the tunnels is that they have booby-trapped the entrances with explosives. The moment they realise the Israelis have entered the tunnel, they will just press the button and the entire thing could collapse on the Israelis. Well, that's the conflict as it's going on. Many of you may be aware of many of these things. If you want to get daily updates about what's going on, subscribe to Times of Israel daily updates. They send you an email every morning and you will get the latest of what is going on in Israel at the time. But Israel are desperately seeking peace and have been living on a knife's edge since 1984. I want to just take you to a couple of scriptures this morning quickly and tell us why Israel do not have peace. Thank you, brother. All found out in Isaiah 59. Thank you, brother. In Isaiah 59, the Lord made this statement: "Behold, the Lord's hand is not shortened that it cannot save, neither his ear heavy that it cannot hear." God here reminds the nation that he's capable of saving the nation any time he chooses. The fact that he's not dull of hearing implies that Israel simply have to call out in repentance to be saved. God will not act until they acknowledge their sin and come to him. Because he says this: "But your sins and your iniquities have separated between you and your God, and your sins have hid his face from you, that he will not hear." That's the thing that separated the nation of Israel in general from his people. He goes on to say this: "The way of peace they know not. There is no judgment in their goings. They have made them crooked paths, and whosoever goeth therein shall not know peace." Idolatry was their major problem at the start. They rejected their Messiah, and today it's largely indifference. And as God said, you will never know peace while you remain in unbelief. This is how he pictures the nation of Israel in these days. "We roar all like bears and mourn sore like doves. We look for judgment, but there is none, for salvation, but it is far off from us. For our transgressions are multiplied before thee, and our sin testifieth against us." Here, this is the cry of Israel. In their grief they growl and moan like angry bears, pitiful doves, but salvation is far from them. But then God adds this: For Zion's sake will I not hold my peace, and for Jerusalem's sake I will not rest. Remember Ezekiel 37, God said there would be a day when they went back into the land in unbelief. And for Jerusalem's sake, God is still in a sense protecting the nation. And then he says this, there'll be a day coming, thou shalt no more be termed forsaken, neither shall thy land any more be termed desolate, but thou shalt be called Hephblah, delight, and thy land Beulah, that is married. For the Lord's delight in thee delighteth in thee, and thy land shall be married, that is, brought back into a relationship with him. Well, we discussed when that happens last night in the Millennial Kingdom, for those of you who are here. Let me just add this in a few minutes of closing. I do not say that Israel do not have something to answer for in this conflict. But I want you to remember that every response or every action by Israel has been in response to attacks upon them. Israel do not want to be in conflict all the time, but they have a right to protect their people. There is a lot of misinformation, and you have to remember that this latest conflict started with Hamas coming out and killing 1,500 people. Were Israel ever going to sit back and allow that to happen? Absolutely not. If somebody did that in our land, we would do the same thing. We would attack the enemies that do that to us. You know, it is terribly sad, the number of civilians and children being killed in the Gaza Strip today. And our hearts do go out to some of those innocent people because they are innocent in a sense. But remember, they elected Hamas as their government. They knew what Hamas's program was, wipe out Israel by any means. And they agreed to that when they elected them. They could have had the Fatah take them over, but they elected to have Hamas lead them. And in a sense, they're paying some of the price of that. As I say, have Israel been absolutely guiltless in this? I don't think so. They have tried to target where Hamas have their headquarters and where they put their launch pads, and unfortunately some of those have been near schools, hospitals, public buildings where people are sheltering. It is a terrible conflict. What is the end of it? I have no idea, nor does anybody. They are certainly targeting Hamas's leadership. Their plan is, for Israel's plan is to wipe Hamas out of the Gaza Strip and govern the Strip themselves. That's their long-term plan. Whether that will come to fruition, I do not know. But I thought it would be good this morning in a Bible class to just give you a background to what all this conflict is about, but also, of course, to remember that ultimately there will be further conflict in the land, I believe, right up until the Antichrist at the beginning of the tribulation somehow brokers a peace accord between the Arab nations around them and the nation of Israel. That will be something to see and something to pray for in a sense, because when that's done, we won't be here. We'll be raptured at the rapture of the church. So I trust that helps us to understand what is going on in the land of Israel today. For those of you who haven't kept track of it, it's a terrible conflict. Thank you, brother.